Go ahead and call the meeting to order. Very grateful for everybody who continues to show up and focus on the solution we're trying to bring in our community. Thank you so much for that. I've asked Jamie to pull up the agenda, and I'm so grateful for the grace that I have some technical difficulties and couldn't do it on my own. So thank you for that help. So the agenda is on the screen and was also sent to everyone prior. So if we could just review the agenda and open the floor for any comment. Does anybody see anything on the agenda that they feel is off, should be adjusted? Any board members seeing anything that? Does it look okay? All right. Yes. And I can't see everyone when the screen share happens. So if for some reason anybody has a comment and I'm not seeing a hand raised or a head nod, feel free to unmute. And at this juncture, we'll open the floor for brief public comment on the agenda items. We do limit to 2 minutes per person. And this is also so whatever feedback we get, we can keep in consideration for the next time that we develop an agenda. So is there anybody from the public that's joining us that would like to share? And again, if you're raising a hand or nodding, I may not see you, so feel free to unmute yourself. Okay, then we'll hop right into our mission. So the mission for this Police Advisory Board is to offer advice to the St. Albans Police Department for the successful implementation of 21st century policing strategies and to assist the police department in following the established roadmap as amended by the City Council. And I'm really grateful. This is our third official board member, and I feel like we've already learned so much and have gathered so much, and we know there's a lot of work to do. And we also know that it's a process, not an event. So I'm just really grateful for the team that's here. So with that, I know we're going to be a little bit ahead of schedule, but I don't want to eat up any more time. I am super excited to be able to jump into the data section. Danielle and Jamie are going to be sharing a little bit. Danielle created a PowerPoint. So Jamie, yep, I see your hand up.
I actually think we need to approve those minutes.
I am so sorry.
No, that's okay. I didn't want to leave it to the end and then forget, and it does look like we have a forum. So
thank you so much. So yeah, if we can move into the meeting minute approval, is there anyone who didn't have a chance to review or receive those? Okay, so can I get a motion for approval of?
So moved.
Thank you, Jamie. Do I get a second?
Seconded.
Thank you. All in favor? Any opposed? Okay, so moved. Thank you so much for that, Jamie. Okay. So that does bring us to the next piece of the data now. So thank you again, Jamie, for sharing your screen. That was extremely helpful. If you want to go ahead and close that piece down. And then Danielle should have the ability to do, okay, there we are. Danielle should have the ability to do a screen share and pull up her PowerPoint. And just let me know if you're able to do that. Perfect.
Okay, can everybody see that? Okay, so, and Jamie, feel free to jump in, or anybody really jump in. But so one thing that we were thinking through discussion is that sometimes it feels like it can be difficult to kind of focus on the data because there's so much, and there's, you know, the different values and philosophies within community policing. And so really looking at, can we just, for one dedicated section of the meeting, just focus on one area? And we felt like embrace community engagement was a good area to start with. And so I just want to remind folks that embracing community engagement is a policing philosophy that should be embedded into the culture of the department. The commitment to work with community members to tackle the immediate and long-term cause of crime or other issues requiring police intervention through joint problem solving, reduces crime and improves quality of life. I think there's a little bit of feed going on from somebody that's on. So just that's kind of the lens of when we're talking about this that we should really keep in mind as we move kind of through this RBA exercise of so just saying that. So I go back and forth. I'm gonna do this. I'm actually gonna skip. So this is kind of the data based on the initial things that we went through with Chief Mo and the data. And correct me if I'm wrong, Jamie, but this is the data that we actually have access to, correct? Okay, so what Jamie was phenomenal in this and went through all of this and felt like based on the data, it felt like this would be a measure of embracing community engagement. So I just felt like it was important for people to kind of see, and I can pull up this slide throughout the presentation of this is what we actually have currently. So is the St. Albans Police Department investigating and responding to community and community complaints in a fair and transparent way? Total breakdown of complaints, total number of internal investigations, total number of investigations conducted by a third-party review board, data, if available, from local, regional, and national police departments and communities of similar size and landscape, and any other fair and impartial policing data. Oh, I think that was just a question of, is there other police data that would fit into this category?
Yeah, and for us, Danielle, that
so far.
Danielle, for us, that letter E, I think ultimately was that resist to I never say it, the resist one, the where people had to put hands on that data.
Response to resistance. Yeah.
Thank you. I get it. I say it the wrong way all the time. But that data also we sort of fit into this bucket as well.
I put that in and it didn't save, so I apologize for that, but I tried to do that last minute this afternoon and apparently I did not do a good job of that. So I will add that in because I remember you saying that. Okay, so again, like we're focusing on embracing community engagement. And so we're going to move into, you know, the kind of 7 population accountability questions. So my goal, and people feel free to give me feedback, is to kind of go through these, get some talking points through that, and then we're going to actually move through kind of the results-based accountability of to say, like, here's the existing measures that we have. Is this the how much, or is anyone better off, and starting to put those things in the kind of appropriate boxes, and then working from there to say, like, what do we need to get, what do we want to see, and there's a whole nother process for that, if that makes sense. Probably not, but I'm kind of tired. It was a long day. So we'll move through the questions. So the first question is, what are the quality of life conditions we want for children and adults and families who live in our community, specifically around community engagement with St. Albans PD?
That's a great question. I'd love to hear if anybody has ideas of what their perspective would be in answering these questions. What are the quality of life conditions we want for the children, adults, and families who live in our community? I know for me, it would be a comfort level and a trust. I'd love to hear what other people have for thoughts and ideas, just so we can kind of brainstorm and start, you know, drilling down on what are the goals, what does it look like? How do we put into words what the quality of life that we are seeking looks like? And feel free to unmute yourself, because again, I can't see all of our board members. And I really want to hear your voices.
I think one.
So I would add safe. Oh, go ahead.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I was about the safety piece, that people, families, condition is that people feel safe in the community.
So Chris, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, so I apologize in advance. So the second part of that is, if that's the condition, like what would that look like? If you were walking down the street, or if you were in the store, like what, how would you know that
Lost Danielle.
I think so. I think I wasn't the only one having technical issues. I think where she was going, oh, there you are. You're back,
Yeah.
Danielle. So it kind of froze on us. It sounded like you were going a little deeper into Chris's answer to say,
Yeah.
what would these conditions look like?
What would it look like? Yeah.
Yeah, what does safe look like?
Great question.
Yeah.
It is a great question. And I wonder too, if any other board members, if something comes to mind, don't hesitate to respond too, because it feels like it should be so easy to answer these questions.
I
And yet
know.
when we get to okay, let's have an example of what our goal really looks like, it's harder to put it into words or make it tangible. And I think that's one of our goals as a board, is to define what is safe, what does that look like, how can we measure it?
Exactly. Yeah. Very difficult things.
As a parent of small children, I know one thing for me would be that safe would mean that I could send my children out into our community and that they would come back to me in one piece without harm or without fear of harm or negative interaction while they are moving about our community.
That's
I think
great.
for me,
That's
I know.
ahead.
Yeah. No, I mean, with a cold, if you wanted to do that. But
Whoop, I think so. I'm going to mute.
yeah, no, it wasn't.
Okay, sorry about that. Somebody didn't have their mute on. Go ahead, Chris. Sorry about that.
I think what I see is that, for me, then the work that I do is that people will feel safe in their homes. And, that, and in the community, because violence doesn't just happen, violence happens everywhere. But a lot of it does happen in the home and on the streets, but that, excuse me, that what it would look like is that we would not have, for me, that we would not have incidences of domestic and sexual violence.
So when I go down that road and think about a couple of the statements that you said, Chris and Jamie, is that, so a measurable thing around that is like, are there enough parks for kids to play at? Because if we had a safe community, there would be ample parks and there'd be lots of kids playing, and you might not see as many adults because it's safe. You might be able to drive through a neighborhood and you don't see as many like bars on windows because people are feeling safe. You might see points of access for services because people trust that law enforcement's not intervening, that it's actually the appropriate resource that's intervening. So you have just more visualization of what are the resources in your community. So that's kind of those are the pieces, like trying to kind of drill down in and see like how would we be able to define that a little bit more. Like I know trust has come up a few times. So like if we trusted law enforcement or if the residents did, like what would that look like? How would you know?
I think it's, what comes to mind for me too would be what does it look like when someone sees an officer walk by? What's their response? What's their body language? How do they, how do they respond when we're talking relative to law enforcement? And when I think relative to the community we live in and what safe would look like, I think, being able to read somebody's body language as they're walking through their community to see if they're holding themselves in a way that they're comfortable, confident, and poised and know that they're safe, or in a way that they're nervous, cowering, and looking over their shoulders. And of course, being a person who works in the field of addiction, That's something that I know, and it's just a challenge, I think, right now with the pandemic, of course, because I believe, a lot of people are carrying themselves in a tone of fear already just with this pandemic. And yet then you add in any other, barriers that might come up that make them feel unsafe, whether it's that they saw a fight break out or they saw a bust or whatever that might be. But for me, what was coming to mind, because I don't have children, so I can't relate as much with that piece. And I love hearing the answers on that because it helps to teach me. But when I think about the adults and the feedback that I hear from some community members in trying to help with people struggling with addiction is keeping, our community clean of evidence of things that are unhealthy. I know that we have teams of individuals that do, for example, butt day, picking up the cigarette butts to keep the community cleaner. There's safe disposals for, drug paraphernalia that may be found in syringes. And, so I think that that's what was coming to my mind. And it's probably because the world that I eat, sleep, and breathe and work in revolves around addiction. But it feels like people would feel more safe if they wouldn't see evidence of, use and fights and robbery and damage. That's what was coming to mind for me. I'm losing the word, but basically when people just kind of destroy other people's property, and when you see that the wreckage of that kind of behavior, that can often, if I'm walking in an area where I can tell that somebody's home has been vandalized or their car, I might feel a little bit less comfortable in that area.
To sort of piggyback on all of these ideas, and I think this was part of the.
I'm just writing all of this.
I think Danielle's on like a major delay.
I think she is too,
She's almost like a time zone behind us. How is it out there in California, Danielle?
You're right.
Did you have something else, Danielle, before I go on with that thought?
Like I'm on such a delay that I'm going to change my internet. And so I might lose you for a minute, but I'll pop back in. Okay.
Okay.
No problem.
So, one of the reasons that this committee was formed, and even on the questions that we've talked about, that we are starting to survey folks that we did on polling day and that we're going to distribute more widely in the coming weeks, is safe also feels like when all other safe conditions are there, i.e., all the things that we've talked about, and still something goes wrong, that you can call somebody and have it be an appropriate interaction regardless of who you are. And I think that that's, one of the questions that was posed to this committee, right? And part of the reason why we tackled this area around, embracing community engagement and the fair and impartial policing is that if I am unsafe, even if my community is fully safe, but there's an unsafe situation, that I would feel confident, comfortable, and that I would get equitable treatment if I called law enforcement to aid me.
Can you hear me? I switched to internet.
We can. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Were you able to capture some of Jamie's response? Awesome. Okay,
I
great.
think so.
Jamie, I'm just going to say, I think that's a super, super good point that you bring up. The way I kind of think of it is we're talking about safety, and we can put it in kind of two buckets. There's community safety, and then there's also safety with law enforcement, trust in law enforcement, and they're related, but they are distinct for sure. And I think it's very wise to emphasize the fact that this committee exists in part because that second bucket, the trust in law enforcement, there is a deficit there that I think is what we can be really helpful in addressing.
Jamie, just to make
Yeah.
sure, because I feel like it was a really important part, can you just kind of paraphrase just to make sure I captured that correctly?
That even when all of the other safe conditions might be met, so we achieve all of those feelings of safety, if there's an unsafe situation, that no matter who I am, my background, and anything about me, if I'm in that unsafe situation, I can call law enforcement and expect safe and equitable treatment.
Okay.
And that's really an indicator of, in my work, if a survivor calls the police and the police respond in a very helpful, caring way, she or he is more likely to call the police another time when she needs that assistance. If not, they're not going to be calling the police, and then they'll be put in a more unsafe situation. So it really, depends on that very first time that there's police intervention, what the outcome is.
I have two thoughts. One also being, and I don't know if this is an appropriate place for it in this, but I think part of community engagement is also like the feedback loop. Like the community is giving you this feedback. And so like, what are you doing with it? And how do we see that? Because that's part of engagement. And then the second piece is also that I think police or law enforcement have been trying to do, a great job in being engaged. And I don't want to take that away. And so I think that's also an element of, you see them in the community, and I know there's opinion whether it's appropriate or not, but like that's a piece of community engagement. And so that's actually really easy to measure as well in some ways. So I don't know how, I'm going to kind of just write that in the notes as that could be a potential measure.
I appreciate you mentioned that point, Danielle, too, because I was thinking after our last meeting about how can we better define the difference between police contact and police connection. I feel like there can sometimes be a little bit of confusion or overlap in a sense that when we look at the roadmap and we look at some of the suggestions and the things that other communities do with having law enforcement, I'm going to use the example of National Night Out or Coffee with a Cop. So these events are specifically held so law enforcement can be in the community and connecting with people. And I look at like that's connection. And that's not the piece that we're wanting to see go away. I think what we're looking to measure is the actual police contact where they're being called and needed for an event. And I guess I just wanted to kind of touch on that because I was thinking about it quite a bit after the last meeting, and maybe we could, look at the language we're using so it doesn't get confusing, because I don't think that the goal is to have them disappear, be out of sight, out of mind. I think it's more so that when we see them, we want to be connected, right? We don't want it to be an incident, but we want it to be connected. So I'm just happy that you kind of touched on that.
So I'm going to move us through, if that's okay, to a couple of the other questions. So when we're talking about some of the things that we've talked about, and I can recap a few of them, is like, how can we measure these conditions? So one concrete example was the community engagement. Simple way to measure that is number of events or community activities that police have had and involved, have had a presence in. But, when we look at like safety or we look at like trust, that there's enough equitable, like your interaction has been equitable as to, and another person that would have and receive the same interaction, like how can you start to measure these things? And we're going to go through an activity to kind of help with that. But initially, some things that you can think of, like one thing that I put was like satisfaction results. We've talked about that feedback loop, and there's not a consistent way that we are necessarily doing that. And so if you knew that for every, I don't know, community event, and this is purely an example, but for every community event that law enforcement was at, and you tallied, 10 random people and said, do you enjoy having the police? Like, do you think there's a benefit to the police having a presence here? And 8 out of the 10 people, you have some sort of measurement and some sort of baseline data to start getting at. And so that's just kind of an example. Or it could be that, someone did have an interaction with law enforcement and someone follows up with them the next day and says like, how was that? And you have an opportunity to give feedback. But so that was one thing that I wrote down. But
thank you. I see that John has his hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, Danielle, I think that's a really It's an interesting point you bring up about surveying events where police are present. However, I just want to flag that at those events, if there is a deficit in trust, you're not going to see the people who don't trust police there. So you're really not going to sample the audience that we need to get at. And I think that hits at the fact that we really, I think the trust building piece is really kind of the foundation of what we ought to be looking at, in my mind.
So to that point, John, because one of the questions is like, how are we doing at that? Like, how are we doing at measuring that? And it sounds like, based on what we initially know, we're not doing a very good job at measuring that. And so some ways we need to kind of prioritize that as we're moving our work forward.
I have one question.
Does-
One thing? Can I just say input one thing real quick? Good point by both of you, but just real quick, one thing we do, we don't check in after events like that normally, but what one of our lieutenants has been doing is he cold calls people after cases that we responded to and just checks, and he randomly picks call numbers and just calls and says, hey, I understand you called the police. When the response was blah, 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 how was the interaction? So that's one way we are checking for satisfaction with our calls. We haven't done it with events like Coffee the Cop or National Night Out, because we assume that those people came voluntarily, but we do it for calls where we're actually called there, whether it's an arrest or anything. He just randomly picks a case number. He has no idea what he's calling about. Those have been very beneficial to us. But just real quick on the events we've had, it's amazing. The National Night Out I've done for as many years back as I can remember, always as a trooper, because this year we canceled it my first time in this role. But I can't tell you, I haven't had a lot, but I'm going to guess between, I'll say 7 and 15 times where I've had kids come up to me and say, my parents hate the police, and drag their parents over and talk to us. It's been pretty impressive the way that interaction has gone. And I've had parents talk to me and say how much they hate the police, but here we are talking, so something's happened. So it's been beneficial. But to your point, John, I'm sure there are people that avoid those events altogether, but we have had some good discussion come out of those events too. So with people that may or may not have normally liked talking to us, but I've never had a bad discussion at one of those. But again, I'm sure there's people that all out avoided it. But the screening of the calls has been a great way for us to, if nothing else, find out how our officers are doing on the road when we're not there watching.
For something like that, I wonder if I'm just trying to think of something to compare it to, but like, have you ever come to this before? Is this your first time? And it seems like that should change over time, right? If this is moving in the right direction, then people who have never gone to a National Night Out for whatever reason, make an attempt to go. And that seems like that would be a correlation to how the community engagement is working, right? Because if I hated cops, like you said, Chief, or some of those other quotes that you've heard before, but I still managed to convince my parents to go, and my parents still talked, that should increase over time, John, hopefully, in all folks who may or may not have trust in the police. So there must be a way to measure that. I don't know what that is, but I guess it seems like there would be a way to capture that information from folks if it's their first time ever going to that kind of event.
Yeah, speaking for myself is difficult. I've done it in multiple counties, so I can't speak only for this county. I'm just relaying the history I've had with those nights.
So building off of the trust piece a lot, because that seems to be that's a priority in this area, is so when you think about that, that's not solely law enforcement who is responsible for improving that relationship in one sense, but so aren't we all? And so when you think about that, who are the partners that have a role to play in supporting law enforcement or bringing the populations, or not bringing, but connecting the populations that don't feel that level of trust? Like, so how do we get more people involved, or who are those people, who are the partners that we need to include in this process, specifically looking at trust?
So that's one of my favorite topics, are community partnerships. Being on the executive lead team for the Franklin Grand Isle Community Partnership, we have, and Chris knows because I see her at a lot of community partner meetings as well. I think I feel like a good action step for me to do, because I do the listserv for that group, and we have approximately 300 people on that list, and I can data sort it by organization. So I think that could be valuable for me to provide on the list of the different community partners, because there are so many, everything down. If you look at medical with Northwestern Medical Center and NCSS and Phoenix House New England, Howard Center, and Samaritan House, CVOEO. There's so many partners. I feel like maybe a way to, and I, there's a part in the agenda I'll get to a little bit more in detail about community partners and how we can better organize and bring together a community partnership with law enforcement and get them invited and involved in some of the meetings. Some of them they've already started attending. But yeah, when I look at community partners, I think it ought to be, I don't think any partner should be excluded, quite honestly, even if you look at retail businesses, to the nonprofits in the area, to service providers. My thought is that we want to be all encompassing. I think to be strategic, definitely drilling a little bit down to identify the organizations that more than likely would be beneficial to partner with. And at the same time, not losing sight of the fact that any partner would be a good partner, I think, in building trust. Jamie, I see your hand.
You finished your sentence a little sooner than I thought you were going to. I was just like preemptively like, hey, when we get a second, I have a question. But you just said it, that triggered me, is that I think that I've been watching a lot of Marvel comics lately, but the anti-partner, right? Like the anti-hero, the person who you would not necessarily identify as the ideal partner, I know for us in healthcare, is sometimes the best partner to have, right? Because they tend to represent the voices or the concerns that might be some community partners who might already be working in this space for their day job, might not have that same level of what's actually happening in the community. So I can't think of the name of the group, but there is a group, an advocacy group in St. Albans. And John, I think maybe you know the name, I can't think of it off the top of my head, that has spoken out about their concerns around law enforcement, right? They might be a great group to partner with in this space, even though it wouldn't be an obvious community partner, because we're thinking of the folks who already are working with SAPD in some fashion. Does that make sense?
Yes, because
Yeah.
that's exactly what I was going to bring up. So thank you for that.
I see John's hand up. John?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a good thought. I just want to raise another point, and I apologize. I feel like I'm going to be the squeaky wheel here tonight. But I agree 100% that in any relationship, trust is to a certain degree, a two-way street, 100%. However, we have to acknowledge the fact that when we are speaking about trust in institutions, right? Law enforcement being an institution, there is an imbalance of power in any interaction, right? So if a member of the community interacts with law enforcement, huge imbalance of power, right? Law enforcement has power in that situation, authority in that situation. So to make the burden of building a trusting relationship equal in that situation is not quite right. So we do, working with law enforcement, we have a bulk of that responsibility. And of course, we're here to help our police department with ideas to do that. But I just want to make sure that we're not, it's not like a person to person relationship, I guess. Does that make sense?
Thank you, John. Chris,
So,
is
I
your
think-
hand up, or is that a thumbs up? It's a thumbs up. Okay, perfect. Just wanted to check. Okay, Danielle.
And I apologize because I can't see everybody, so I'm just kind of talking whenever I want to and act like I
You-
own the show.
You're doing great.
Oh,
But
sorry.
I'm also,
I have
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm
Back
so
to you,
sorry. I
John.
realized, I'm so sorry. I realized I had one piece, and I think, you know, as we are helping our police department engage or build trust in the parts of our community where that trust is not as strong as others. I think one of the most fundamental things we can work on is, you know, a robust accountability structure on the law enforcement side. Because if you think about the relationships that people, you know, have day to day with other institutions, where trust is maybe less of a question, or maybe more taken for granted, or maybe more of a given. If you look into those relationships, I think you see, you know, really kind of clear accountability structures there that we might almost see as automatic. So that's just another thought there. Sorry, I intended to say it in the first bit.
So, John, can I ask you, so when you think about community engagement, do you have any initial thoughts around, like, what are some accountability structures with that?
Well, I mean, so I think about, you know, if I think about other institutions that people have trust relationships with, right? Whether it's a business, whether it's a even, I guess, to a certain degree, in a facet of government, the accountability structures kind of, you know, they're fairly simple. You know, if I go to get my haircut and I get a bad haircut, well, the accountability is I don't go there anymore, you know, and I tell my friends, oh, I got a bad haircut over there. And so they're incentivized to do, you know, because it's their reputation. But when we look at, you know, necessary institutions like law enforcement, it's not like I can say, like, well, I'm not gonna have the St. Albans Police Department come pull me over again because I didn't like the way that went. You know, it's not up to me. So,
Right.
So I guess I don't know exactly what the accountability structure looks like in this point, but I just, you know what I mean? I think about that, you know, to a certain degree, we can't, you know, we have, the community doesn't necessarily get to choose the police department it has, but we can, I don't know where I'm going with this. Sorry.
Well, no, I kind of put you on the spot because it's one that I know we've bounced around in different conversations of, like, it's hard to do that piece. And so I just didn't know if there was something that stuck out with you. And it's really for me just to incorporate into notes and try to put some structure.
No, absolutely. And I think that's a really important thing, right? Is because, you know, it's our job here, right? We want to be able to present our police department with solutions, with ideas, with, you know, try this to make it better. And it's, you know, it's all well and good to say what's wrong, but if we don't have, you know, positive movement ideas, then, but yeah, I think that maybe is an interesting piece where we could try and involve some of the communities or some of the parts of this community where we know that trust in the police is somewhat lacking, and just say, what would make you trust police more? I mean, it's, you know, we may not, you know, not everything we get may be actionable, but, you know, at least it would be maybe a step in the right direction.
John, you know, you bring up a good point. Coming from healthcare, it's sort of similar in that the hospital is the hospital. And when you're having your worst day, you may or may not be able to elect whether or not, you know, the person, you had the right experience with that person. And that doesn't mean that you won't necessarily come there again. I mean, healthcare is a little bit more commercial, and the power that you mentioned before, relationship is a little different. But when you're having an emergency, you go where the people who can take care of you, and you provide feedback after. But I know, one of the important steps that we have to do is to make sure that people feel like there's a step process, right? So I have a bad interaction with this physician. I didn't care for their bedside manner. My surgery didn't go the way that I wanted to. Some things the surgeon may have been able to control, some not, but he still had a negative interaction. So who can they talk to that's not that surgeon, right? Like, what's the chain of command that concern goes, and how do they make sure that it goes to someone who has an impact on that surgeon, right? I'm picking on surgeons. I really have friends who are surgeons, and so I apologize to any of my surgeon friends that are watching. You're all great, but that's the reality of it, right? Is that they want to know that their voice is being heard somewhere, and that if there's another place, whether it's our board of directors, the CEO, whoever that person is, that there's another place. And my office is oftentimes that other place, right? Like, we want to call, we're really unhappy with Dr. Jones. Not only did he mess up my foot, but he was a jerk and he made my wife cry. Okay, great. So I'm going to take all that information and I'm going to work with Dr. Jones's team and his leaders, and all the way up to our chief medical officer, if I have to get you some resolution. I'm going to provide you with that resolution, and I'm going to assure you that our board of directors is made aware of all of the concerns about Dr. Jones that have come forward in the last year, because that's part of their work in ensuring that good doctors are taking care of our community. Sometimes it feels very bureaucratic, but once you get into that and that becomes public information, Chief, not the individual cases like to the detail that I just said, but that in general, that there's a good faith belief that that information is going to go somewhere beyond the person who's pulling me over or who's doing my surgery. That sometimes helps even communities that feel really, and in healthcare we see it too, they can't afford to pay. There are challenges socioeconomically. There are challenges with education level that we want to make sure that they're feeling that their voice is heard regardless, and setting those infrastructures in place and having a group like this where that data comes consistently and we're providing guidance sometimes is helpful just all by itself.
Yeah, I think as far as complaint process goes, I think that was a big step that Vermont made with Act 56. That was why it was designed for agencies that never had even an internal affairs process. It forced that on everybody, which most legitimate agencies had an internal affairs process, but there must have been at least a few in Vermont somewhere that didn't have anything, and that's where Act 56 grew legs.
Also, Jamie, you make me think, because working at NCSS, we have a similar process. There's a lot of people that don't want to engage in therapy for numerous reasons in home and community-based services because of being stigmatized or trust, or they think that we're DCF and we're going to take their kids away. And so that comes up a lot. And we have a very similar process about filing a complaint grievance appeal procedure. And one thing, and I wonder if Chief Mo, you could talk about this, is we have to publish that. Like, we have many different stakeholders that we have to report that data to, that hold us accountable to. So it just makes me feel like, is that a little bit of a missing piece of this? Is that if I'm going to publish in the St. Albans Messenger that 85% of our clients say that they're satisfied with their services, if really 60% of them are not, I'm going to get feedback around like, this is not accurate. Like, how are you? And so it continues the dialogue from a community perspective of like, this seems off. And so I just wonder if there's any type of that transparent communication with the public around that.
So the only thing, as right now, I think the only thing we publish is our stats regarding the response resistance and IAs, which are the complaints that actually come in. As far as satisfaction, we'd have to be careful on how we do it, because we can publish anything, but the problem is that we are a police agency. So whatever we do, we don't get called to people because they're having a good day. So like I always say, as an extreme example, you can pull over the nicest person in the world, and if you write them a ticket because they're going 20 miles an hour over the speed limit, likely you're gonna get a bad review. I don't care how you handle it. You may get a good review. There are some people out there that actually thank you for a ticket, but it's pretty rare. So it's very hard. You have to make sure that the parameters of what you're asking the questions are fair. Otherwise, you're going to get a negative review no matter how you do it. You'll get that person that, they had a dispute with their neighbor, and one side's gonna be, yeah, I'm glad the police came because the dispute went my way, but you're always gonna have the other side that's very unhappy the way it went, and that's just the nature of our business. If you ask it in a way where you handle, was the officer polite and courteous and professional, you may get an honest response even from the person that the dispute didn't go their way, but oftentimes they're still gonna be mad at somebody, and it's typically law enforcement.
I wonder if there's a different way to kind of reframe that a little bit, because that is, when you're talking about satisfaction surveys are one piece of that, but also from this particular lens that the measure that we're looking at, or the value, the philosophy, is trust and engagement and
Yeah.
having safe communities.
Yep.
So I'm hoping even if somebody had a negative interaction with law enforcement, they'd still say, I feel safe in my community.
Yes. So
And so
that's
I
what it's all about, the wording, right? And what you're looking to extrapolate from the data. That's the question. And what we get for feedback, and looking through that feedback through a lens that allows you to realize what's going to be negative no matter how it went, and what's actual fair data. But I think you can get it, yes. And we have no problem putting it out there so everybody can see it, as long as we take into account, try to get it as fair and accurate as we can. Because as you've seen from all the press in the last 6 months, there are people that are going to be negative no matter what, for stuff that's happened in the past. And I understand that, but I'd really like to get down to the accurate day-to-day personal data, rather than just stuff that's happened to people they don't even know. We need to get accurate data that's happening as we speak, not historical.
I think it might be, you're totally right, Chief Lamont, that, people, ask for a kind of a customer satisfaction at the end of a police interaction might be a dubious prospect, because, that's hard to get around from. But I wonder about the complaint process, and I know you talked with us about that a little bit. How is it? Would you mind just going over just very briefly, like how that works internally?
Yep. So I can, yeah, absolutely. So anybody can make a complaint. They can make it a number of different ways. Primarily, my experience wise, and I think realistically, the most common way is people either call in a complaint or they come to the PD to make a complaint. But they can make it on Facebook or anonymously, or even through a third party. For example, Chris could take a complaint just because she deals with a lot of people. So she could get a person to go to Chris and make a complaint through voices. But typically somebody shows up at the office or calls in. If they go any other way but showing up at the office, we try to encourage them to come to the office to actually fill out the form, but they don't need to. But it's easier if they do, because there's no doubt it's them writing it in their words rather than us taking over the phone and transcribing it. So if they come in and fill it out, a sergeant goes out, meets with them outside, because our building is locked down due to COVID. If it wasn't, they'd meet them in the lobby or in a room off the lobby where it's quiet. They take the information. They don't have to put their name down, but it's helpful if they can, so our investigator can follow up with them. But sometimes people don't, and they put down as much detail as they want. We don't paraphrase; they write it themselves. On the top of the form, it says if they need a translator, then we will call one for them. Once a complaint is filed with that supervisor, he takes it directly from there into our lieutenant, who's in charge of internal investigations. They look at it real quick without investigating, but just to see if there's any part of the complaint that looks like it's an arrestable offense, like if they're accusing an officer of something that's arrestable, which we have to move on like now, like we have to suspend the officer till we get to the bottom of this, because we don't want an officer out there that's could potentially be arrested. Or if it's just a policy violation, serious, not serious, or if it's somebody just came in and say, yeah, I got passed on the interstate by somebody going way too fast. That's not something that is of dire need. So we kind of disseminate it from there where it's going. And then the decision is made, is it going to be investigated in-house by our lieutenant, or is it going to go out to an outside agency for an internal investigation? And then the process goes from there. Immediately, if it's not the one that is just handled by a first line supervisor, meaning, they got passed by somebody driving too fast, or they were treated rudely, pretty much those are the only two. Anything above that is going to have a full internal investigation. We write a letter to that person that made the complaint, as long as they supplied a name, which I've never had one that didn't supply a name yet. I'll write a letter to them. It's a form letter, but it's just a letter saying, on this date we received your complaint, investigation number is this number for your reference, and this investigator has been assigned to it. We'll keep you updated as this complaint moves forward. Send that to them, and the investigation process starts. That's kind of the nuts and bolts of it.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think, sorry, I don't mean to talking so much tonight. So there's a couple things that I noticed that could be points where opportunities to build more trust. The first is, in that process, the first step, like you said, is contacting the police, and preferably going to the police station.
Yep.
So I have to point out that if we are hoping to engage with communities that have challenging relationships with the police or don't trust the police, that right there is going to be a huge barrier.
Yeah, they can go to City Hall. Like, we've had people go to City Hall to make the complaint. We've had them go to the state police barracks so they feel more comfortable. I mean, we'll explain that if somebody says they don't want to come down, but we prefer if they did, just to make sure that whoever they're getting the actual information, because the last thing we want is somebody paraphrasing it differently than it was told to them. But we do explain. We've had one person so far say they didn't want to come down, so we had them go to City. But we do. Yes.
Of the people that have contacted you, and that my question is, I wonder if there are, people that might say, and then I guess, so my second thought is, so when it goes to a beyond the lieutenant and internal investigation, is that a state agency that does that, or how does that work?
No, currently the agency that we use would be the MRI out of New Hampshire, Municipal Resources Incorporated. They're a company they're the same company that came in July or August, and they're the ones that are helping us get more or less CLIA alignment. So that's where we're doing our policies through, and actually they're probably one of the ones that is more or less behind this board, the initiation of this board. They made a lot of the suggestions with the transformational map and everything else. Their expertise is backgrounds, internal investigation, municipality reforms and regroupings. So they're the ones that would help us with investigation if we sent it out to somebody else.
Gotcha. I think that another possible place of, another possible place of an opportunity to build a little bit more trust. And I'll point this out kind of like as gently as I can, because I realize that it may not actually be the case, but I would suggest that the perception exists, whether or not there's any truth to it, I don't know, but I believe that the perception exists that if I complain to the police and it's handled internally, that it's essentially the department investigating itself, and then as me, who someone is, questions that, I may not feel like that's really getting thoroughly done. Again, I'm not saying that that's, that it's not, because I believe, we're people of integrity here. But if we're talking about perception and trust building in communities, I think that may be an opportunity. I don't know if there's a way, again, I don't know how you get around it, but that comes to mind as a place, as an opportunity to build trust.
No, that is a great point. And I've heard that for 22 years with the state police, that nobody does the internal investigations for you. You do them yourself. And unless you hire somebody like MRI, but it's very expensive, pay per investigation. But I will tell you this, that's another thing that Act 56 did. So when we complete our internal investigation, it goes down there for a committee review. So and what they do, they don't redo the internal investigation, but they're making sure a thorough, fair investigation was completed by the agency. And it puts a lot of onus on the agency, because it's me and only me. It doesn't matter that I didn't do the investigation. The chief or the sheriff, whoever's the head of the agency, is the one that's responsible for that being done. And by saying that it's been completed fairly and accurately, you're the one that's on the hook for that. You're the one that could lose your certification for that. So it put a lot of onus on the heads of those departments when that act came through. So as soon as we're done, when we take the initial internal investigation complaint, we have 10 days to notify the academy that a complaint's been sent into us. And the reason you have 10 days is because it has to be a collaborated complaint. So we have to make sure there's some truth to it, because believe it or not, you do have some people that either have the wrong agency or have a complaint that was nothing. So we have 10 days, we send it down, say, hey, just so you know, we have a complaint that came in of this. It's a real brief. then at that point you have 30 days to send in the completed investigation, unless it's a really big deal, which knock on wood, I don't know of any like that yet anywhere. And then when it's complete, you send them everything, the complete packet, and they review it. So there is that on the end of it. So that hopefully gives people some assurance that there is an outside agency that looks at it. And it's not members of the academy that look at it. It's a 24-person committee that, to my knowledge, 24 people is made up of mostly civilian staff, or not even staff, civilian panel. And I don't know the makeup, but that's my understanding.
So
Do you think people
I
even
am
know
totally-
that?
Sorry.
Sorry.
I was gonna ask.
Probably not. That's only been in place since what, July of 18. And again, that came out of people. Well, I won't even say they were not people. It came out of the fact that there were some agencies, to my knowledge, that didn't have a great internal affairs policy or process. Having come from the state police, I'll speak this. The state police is the biggest agency in Vermont, right? Most resources of any other agency, but we, when I was a state police, did not do internal investigations for other agencies unless it was criminal in nature. So if you were a small agency at the time, you really didn't have a lot of choices to do internal investigations unless you hired somebody. Well, I can tell you from my experience now, hiring another agency is very expensive, because you're not talking another police agency that says, hey, I'll do it for you for nothing. That's not the case. You're hiring a private agency. It's not cheap. So either you did the best you could, or you came up with a really good plan, like policy and investigation unit, which costs money, like we did, to send somebody to training and get brought up to speed. And most agencies have done that. But Act 56 forced that. They forced you to do that, or the head of your agency is in big trouble, because it says you will conduct a thorough and fair investigation, or you will more or less pay to have it done. You will facilitate it being done for you. So it's you have two choices, but it will get done one way or the other. But to your question, does the public know that? I don't know. I mean, I've talked about Act 56 a number of times. I know state police talks about Act 56 because they want to make it known to people that the buck doesn't stop here. It does go on.
So Chief Mo, I just wonder, so part of this is coming up with no cost, low cost ideas, because it's not like we all have financial resources, but
No.
I just wonder if that's a point, if someone formals a complaint, could you even just send a letter saying, here's the process and who else, this is all, like, everybody that's involved. So it's not just you're doing it and it's behind the doors and nobody knows. It's behind the scenes,
So
nobody knows.
anybody can request our policy, which that's right in our policy. Act 56 is barely defined in our IA policy, but what I could explain that somewhere, we could show it to them. But I thought I'm sorry, I thought you were gonna ask me if I could just send them to, I can't, nobody can bypass us and go down there, but
No,
I mean,
so
I answer that, but I could upload our policy, so people could see it, but it is directly in there that at the end, it will go to the academy.
I think that.
Do you have, oh, sorry.
Sorry, and then I'll stop. I just think the intent, and so like when we get complaints and grievances, I'm the one that's responsible for reviewing that. And everybody that sends one, it's a very fine process of, it doesn't matter whether I agree, whether it's going to the state or not. I send them a letter that outlines all of their rights, all of their responsibilities, all of the contact if they have questions, and then a very bulleted process of what's actually going to happen, so that they're just aware. Because I think when people don't know, there are a lot of assumptions made, and that's where their perception becomes reality. So the more that you're adding information to help shape that, it's more transparent, and people aren't assuming that it's just some investigation happening that nobody knows about.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so our policy, that policy was passed as a second one behind selection policy, was the IA policy, which I think is really good. And with that comes like 7 or 8 forms, which is, we never had these before. The form that we accepted their complaint and it's in the process, one that if we needed to update them along the way, and one that has a conclusion to it. But in that, it tells them, the investigation is ongoing. We could have one that tells them to include if there is anything more to it, Act 56 may kick in, and the officer could be sanctioned by them up to include their decertification. But we don't have anything in there right now that lists that part of what could happen to them if Act 56 was to get involved as far as a disciplinary action. Because that is the other part. But Act 56 also allows the academy to instill their own discipline if they so chose. And I don't know if that has happened yet to anybody. It could have happened to people that we no longer have employed with us, but I don't know. I wouldn't be notified of any other officers, but that is also what they have in their pockets. They have the ability to discipline as well. But we could add something like that just so they know what the possibilities are. But right now, I feel like we're doing pretty good, letting people know at least where we are at, and that we've had multiple calls, keeping them apprised along the way. But there's always more you can do.
I think you just answered it, but my question was do you give them your complaint is resolved letter
Yeah.
form? That's one of the forms you just said, right?
Yeah, and it's internal, so we can't tell them what. We can just say
Right.
if it was the state with the five possibilities: sustained, not sustained, exonerated. And if there was disciplinary, we'll just tell them that there's disciplinary action. We can't get into what it was.
I do think to Danielle's point, and I'm sure it's very similar for us too, we have a pamphlet, right? Of like, here are all the people that we report to if you're dissatisfied. And I appreciate you can't send people right there, but I do think that people take some solace in having a name of something or even a law that they can refer to, right? So if they wanted to complain to someone else, they could say, that's in the letter.
Because the only person they can complain to at that level is the city manager. And they can't complain about Act 56. That's completely separate.
Right.
They can complain to the city manager if they're not happy with the outcome of the actual internal.
Okay. And then the Act 56 is behind the scenes for you, your level. Yeah. Okay.
I can't even complain about Act 56. I have no say. That's a completely separate entity. All the goal of Act 56 is to make sure that the state of Vermont is regulating police officers. They don't want to see repeat offenses by the same officer or an egregious offense by a police officer. If they do, they want the option to discipline and or decertify forever. So they look at all complaints coming in and they want to judge and critique it and make sure that good officers are still on the road and bad officers are no longer on the road. So this was a way for them to categorize officers and check, because before this, quite honestly, if you were a bad officer in a PD and you did something and then the department fired you, because of the way HR works, and I'm sure many of you on this panel are much more familiar with HR than I am, the rules and regs, you can't talk about stuff. So they left one agency, went to another agency, got rehired. Nobody had any record of why they got fired in the first place, and they could do the same shit in another part of the state. Nobody knew. So Act 56 was a way to categorize everything, keep everything in contact, and that it was a great way to do it. And then even better, with each offense that went down, they may even discipline them right there, including decertification. So they never had a chance to go to another agency to begin with because they're decertified for the first offense. So as a great law, as a great statute, it's unfortunate it took till 2018 to get there. So I think it's great, because I can tell you, at least I would say one officer from St. Albans PD will probably never work again. So
I just would like to go back to John's point too, a little bit around, I appreciate that someone can come to the police department or they can go to City Hall to file a complaint. I think that's still a real barrier. Just speaking to somebody that works with marginalized populations, I'm going to say that 90% of our services are actually us going to them so that they can have access. And so I just wonder if there's a creative way of maybe even partnering with one of the community agencies to support you, of like, if someone is in a place where they're wanting to file a complaint, like, is there some way to get to them so that you're getting that information? Because ultimately that's just going to make, the perception stronger, or you're going to get feedback that's actually going to improve the system. So I'm kind of sitting with that and just wanted to kind of throw that out there, that I wonder if that's an opportunity for us to further explore a little bit more as well.
We're open to anything. We'll take a complaint from anybody, just like we did at state police. I mean, I hate to identify an agency, because I can tell you the one that comes to mind I'm thinking easily is NCSS, but I would never put them in that position because we work too closely with them. So I wouldn't want people to associate them, because if they have a negative outcome with an internal affair, I don't want them thinking that now NCSS can't be trusted. I would rather have them not trust us than NCSS, to be honest with you. So I don't know I wouldn't want to identify one, maybe just get out there that they can go anywhere, which I would hope people would realize. But I certainly understand your point and your concern that they still feel there's no place to make a complaint. I don't know the answer to that. Other than if they call, everybody in my office knows that if somebody calls a complaint, we'll do whatever we can to get that complaint. If they want to write it on a piece of paper and leave it on a park bench or staple on a park bench, we'll go pick it up. But it's that easy. But I don't know how to identify. I just don't want to make it they go to Voice Against Violence and that's going to be their door to make a complaint, or NCSS, because again, if they have a negative outcome, I don't want them to then shun that agency.
I'll just say I'm not necessarily worried about that, but to your point, I lost my point actually. It went in one ear and right out the other. I just feel like we could be a resource to you, and that's I know what my point was. As a service provider, I actually would almost feel the opposite, and that I would be nervous that you would, if I was working with a client and they said, I want to file a complaint against law enforcement, I would worry about how that was perceived on our relationship. I would, ultimately always want to support my client, but I think even that and educating service providers, because I did know that, I did know that you could take a complaint from anyone.
Yep.
And so just saying,
Anybody.
we're here to kind of strengthen the system together.
Yep.
And so we want you to know, if you're hearing things, please support people and their
Yep,
rights.
absolutely. But AmCare might be a choice, honestly, but because we work closely with them, but I'm sure they would take complaint forms up there. I need to step away for 1 second. My battery's about to die. I just need to get a charger. I'll be right back.
To speak up too, I saw Jamie put an idea in the chat, and I feel like you took the idea from my mind and put it in writing about what about the potential of an online link of some sort for people to file that way. That's what I was also thinking, because the population that we work with often may be more comfortable in doing something online as opposed to showing up in person, or writing a note and putting it on a park bench. But I think that's a great idea, and I just wonder if we could explore the possibility of that happening.
So I don't have the agenda pulled up because I have with my PowerPoint, and I want to be mindful of that. So
Yep.
Jamie and Melinda, I didn't know how much more time we had left, and kind of if there was something else you were hoping to get from this. I took 3 pages of notes. So what I'm going to start doing is putting them in categories of trust, safe, community engagement, and start identifying some of the measures under each of those. And then there were actually some concrete kind of solutions that came out of this. So I want to put, identify those as solutions. And then we can start identifying what do we actually want to turn the curve on and start looking at those more specifically. And I just want to remind people, this is a lengthy process. I think sometimes we join committees and we're like, we're going to change the world and things will change really quickly. And this is going to take a long time.
We are
Unless
at
you wanna
time.
meet every day.
We are at time, Danielle. We're a couple minutes over, so wherever.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you so much, Danielle. I appreciate, and actually I love the fact that what we've been talking about and working on is a great segue into the next piece on the agenda, which was committee overview. So what I've communicated by email a little bit, and it's a great segue after what you just said. I'd love to see us solve the world yesterday. And it is a process. It's going to take time. I also think that we have so much work to do that if we move forward with more committees than just so far, we're still a new board. I think you're still screen sharing. Oh, there it is. Okay. So far we have, we've met once to go over data, and in speaking to some of our board members and email, I think creating committees so we can get more focused can be a lot more effective. So what we've come up with, and this is where I want to get the thoughts and feelings from our board members. I sent out an email to, kind of think about the ones that I listed, but to get a data committee and to have, 2 to 3 people on that committee that can focus on data. Also to get a hiring committee and have 2 to 3 people on that committee to focus on more so being available if as needed when officers are going to be interviewed. Oftentimes there's a need for community members. Police advisory board members would be fantastic for that. So that would be one piece of it. The other piece would be to, we can't influence and select the officers, but we can look at maybe ideas and suggestions to share. The community partnership committee. And I think that's where, when I was saying, oh, this is a great segue into this topic. And when we're talking about community partnership, and we're also talking about building trust with law enforcement, we are wanting to seek as much feedback from our community members as possible. We also want to select some feedback. Hold on, okay. We also want to select feedback from our community partners, because there might be some community partners that have never partnered with law enforcement or don't know how to even begin that relationship. And in my previous experience, taking law enforcement to share the model of the embedded crisis workers, we did have them present at the Franklin Granda Community Partnership. And also that was 4 or 5 years ago. So with this community partnership committee, that would be kind of a focus, is how can we make a lot of the information that we're talking about here and the new policies and procedures known to those community partners. So when they're communicating with individuals that they're serving, that they can sometimes help to answer some of those questions or clarify if you do have a complaint or a thought, here's the pathway in which to share it. And then the last committee would be the policy and procedure committee to review policies, make recommendations. So those are the 4 committees. I would love to get feedback from our board members on if you think that sounds, if you think that there's anything that is missing, if you think that sounds good, having these 4 different committees. I think that way we can get a lot more work done and also get people on the committee that they might be more interested in. And we can talk about it, after this meeting as far as who's going to be on which committee, what that looks like. But just wanted to get some feedback if you feel like we're capturing, if we had to choose kind of 4 key committees so we can start getting some work, more work done. Does this feel like the right choices for committees?
Regarding the hiring committee, I'm sorry, I had to turn my attention away for a second. Hiring of whom?
So the hiring committee would be kind of have like 2 different roles. One role, so it would be more as needed, right? That's one of the committees that I don't envision that would necessarily set up, a regular monthly meeting, so to speak. But a great example, right? But a great example is when there are officers that are going to be interviewed that and Mo, as Chief Lamothe reached out, because they're in the process of setting that up in the near future, that having a member of the Police Advisory Board or 2 members of the board to be present in those interviews, that would be one piece of it. The other piece too is during the interview process, if there's any ideas or feedback that you have, we can't change that process. There's pieces of that process that's completely out of our control. But our realm is more, making recommendations or bringing ideas to the table. So it'd be kind of those two pieces. That's kind of what the hiring committee would look like.
Thanks for the clarification.
My goal is within the next week to send an email with more description of the committees, and then to try to confirm who would be on the committees, the frequency of meeting. And again, there's, some of the committees may not need to meet at a regular frequency. It might be more so as needed, like the policy and procedure committee. If there's a new policy that's going to be coming out, then they'll probably want to set up meetings. On the flip side, it doesn't mean that it's not a calculated scientific every once a month. We know this is going to come up. It's going to be as needed. So it's definitely open for discussion. And I just want to check on the chat to make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, so I saw we do have an update on the survey, Jamie.
Yes. Well, Chris asked, I wasn't sure if you could see, the chat while you had the share screen up. So Chris did ask the question about the survey and the data feedback that we talked about. And despite the fact that I may have gotten hypothermia, I did stand outside on voting night, and I did poll a few folks, and obviously there wasn't a lot of traffic, and I only lasted about an hour and a half before my blood thinned. But what was interesting to me was that we did ask those 3 questions that we had sent out over email, and it spurred some great conversation with some folks, and particularly in, just even checking your own biases. The answer that you thought you might have got from someone when you started asking them was very different than what you ended up getting, right? And it was, even in the 4 or 5 people that I talked to, it was a surprisingly mixed bag about whether they would feel comfortable about calling SAPD. And none of it was in a negative or harmful way, but just in a, I would have concerns in this specific arena. So I do think that it was a good, and that's not data that I would take to the bank because that's a small amount, right? And you need to have the right quantities to make data make sense. But I think it's worth capturing some of that information on a broader scale if we can, because I think that will be an important way to sort of tap into that group. I think, John, you were referencing earlier, the folks who truly may not trust in law enforcement in our community, to speak to a group that's not law enforcement might be an opportunity for us to get some more of that feedback, just based on the small grouping of answers that I got last Tuesday.
Yeah, and
So-
to follow up on that
Thanks.
too, Chris, the next step that we're going to do now that voting day is over, we're going to pursue doing a Survey Monkey. We had talked about different ideas of how to distribute the survey, and it looks like that's going to be the direction we're going to go. In the email that I send out next week, when I touch on the committees, I'll also provide a better update. I'm just waiting a couple of answers on some technical pieces of how to get that survey going. But that's the goal, is to make sure that we can distribute it via social media. And then down the road too, we had talked about possibly going through the newspapers, the Counter Courier, the Messenger. I think that would be that's not an impossible task, but I think we're trying to look at, okay, well, how can we move as quickly as possibly? So it's kind of one little bite at a time. That first we focused on town meeting day. Now our next focus is going to be on the Survey Monkey to do through social media. And then we can look at the next step and the next piece, which could potentially be through newspapers. I think it's something a process we'll learn as we go on how, if we're getting a lot of good feedback through social media, because it seems to be the best delivery system these days, then maybe we won't need to pursue those other avenues. So, and I know we're getting close to time for this section too. So I'll just, let our board members know that in the email that I send out within the next week, that I'll list those committees, give a little bit more detail and definition. And again, there's no pressure if somebody's not comfortable being on any specific one, where the goal is just to find a way that we can be effective and get more work done. And also to put our strengths and talents and interests in the area that works best for us. So please don't hesitate, as always, in the meantime, to email me and let me know your thoughts, and we'll connect on that. The only other thing that I see that I didn't clearly list, but I wanted to touch on is that, thank you, Mo, that I wanted to touch on was that we've talked about possibly changing the board meeting day of the week of the month. That's something I'm still trying to find the best solution moving forward, a day and a time that will work for everybody as much as possible. What I am hoping to propose is to stick to the Wednesday for the next month, for April, for the second Wednesday. The other thought that I have is, because we're going to be forming these committees and having the ability to get some work done, that if we could possibly make our police advisory board from 1.5 hours to 1 hour, that will enable, when I have some timelines for individuals that say, well, I could do this, but I would have to be a half hour late or leave a half hour early, that if we have a shorter police advisory board meeting, and we're adding committee meetings where we can still get the work done and then some, that might be a solution. So I wanted to run that by you all to see if we could make our April meeting still be same time, same place, same length of time, but following April and getting the committees up and running, if we could shorten the length of the board meeting, and then I can hopefully find a time that will continue to work for people moving forward. Does that sound like a good idea? And I can communicate more through email, but if I saw too many heads shaking, then I would know, no, not a good idea. We won't pursue it. I see a lot of head nodding and thumbs up. Okay, great. So, and that's something that I'll summarize when I email you all next week as well. So I think that's what we'll look towards moving forward, is that we're still going to be focusing on the second Wednesday of the month, which brings us to April 17th at, let me just make sure I'm saying that right. I had to pulled up, sorry, April 14th. So Wednesday, April 14th at 5 o'clock to 6:30. And after that would be when we're going to go to an hour. So that brings us to the next portion on our agenda, which is public comment. If there's anybody from the public that would like to make comment, share with us, we always, as you know, welcome it, appreciate it. Again, I can't see everyone on my screen with the screen share. So if you raise a hand and I don't call your name, please don't hesitate to unmute yourself and just state your name. I'm actually able to make my screen a little larger, and I don't see that. I'm not seeing any hands. Okay. So in that case, I don't want to hold everybody here. If there isn't any comment from the public, anything else from our board members? And if not, if I could get a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you, Jamie. Can I get a second? Anybody want to second that motion?
I second.
Thank you, Chris. All in favor? Say
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, thank you all so much for attending, for your participation. Have an amazing night, and I will talk to you soon. And thanks again, Jamie and Danielle, for the technical support with the agenda. Danielle, what a beautiful PowerPoint, getting the conversation going. Thank you so much.
Night, everyone.
Bye, everyone.